In this section, I am going to discuss hemostasis. And in discussing hemostasis, I'll also just very briefly also look at the arachidonic pathway, because I keep getting one enzyme wrong, and really, getting an enzyme wrong means that there are issues there. So anyway, this is the first part of hematology, so I'm quite pleased in the sense that I'm obviously moving on to hematology, and I'm obviously making progress towards the things that I actually do have to cover. So hemostasis is obviously the formation of a blood clot, which really is when I say the formation of a blood clot, I don't mean in terms that that just says spontaneous blood clot formation, but in fact I mean that it is the formation of a blood clot that in response to injury, and it is what actually initiates repair and stops people bleeding to death. So, hemostasis, obviously hemo is blood, stasis is slowing down of blood, results in clot formation, ultimately leading to bleeding, cessation in response to injury, in particular what I'm discussing, in response to injury. Obviously I want to stress that spontaneous clot formation and spontaneous bleeding do happen in the body, and they obviously happen due to a balance, for hemostasis for blood flow to be maintained. There has to be a very good balance between procoagulation factors and anticoagulation factors. For example, if we think of them as being on a seesaw, where we can have anticoagulants here, and then we can have procoagulants on the other end of the spectrum. And too much of procoagulants can lead to things like DVTs, pulmonary embolism, strokes, heart attacks, and DICs. Yeah. And then anticoagulation, obviously too much of anticoagulants leads to bleeding and obviously, hemorrhaging and a lot of blood loss. Obviously a good balance has to be maintained between the two, and the balance is maintained by vascular endothelium and indeed the platelets themselves, but most importantly it is the vascular endothelium, the vascular endothelium secretes factor. If I say factor, then it sounds like clotting factors, but secrete substances, including proteins that prevent spontaneous clot formation and indeed spontaneous bleeding. Obviously the prevention of bleeding is by maintaining the integrity of the endothelium itself and preventing off clot formation spontaneous, shall you say, and the prevention of spontaneous clotting is via the secretion of nitric oxide, for example, which is released by the vascular endothelium via sulfate, heparin, or is it heparin sulfate? Heparin sulfate. Yeah, I think it's heparin sulfate actually. Heparin sulfate via secretion again of thrombomodulin, via secretion of prostacyclin, and via secretion of tissue factor inhibitors, shall we say. So the an unharmed and an uninjured vascular endothelium will secrete all of these substances, and all of these substances prevent clotting, clot formation, and they also prevent platelet activation. So they prevent all of that. So in terms, since I have mentioned things like prostacyclin, I'll quickly say how prostacyclin is actually made in the human body, because that will link in quite nicely to thromboxane, which is the other side of the spectrum, which is actually secreted by activated platelets. So prostacyclin, which is obviously an antiplatelet, which is a platelet inhibitor and also a vasodilator. It actually also has vasodilatory properties, prevents clotting and platelet activation, and it comes from as in, I'll say a membrane, or shall we say membrane phospholipid will, this is the enzyme that I keep getting wrong. I have to get it correct today so that I can move away from this cycle. I used to have this pathway there written in permanent markers so that I would remember all the enzymes. And clearly I deleted it before I even made it a habit of going over it every day, which is what I used to do. Anyway, this enzyme, the key enzyme which breaks down the membrane phospholipid, is called a phospholipase A. I think it's A2. And then it breaks down the membrane phospholipid into arachidonic acid, which is then broken down by a number of enzymes, including 1, 2. How should I just do 2? So it will be broken down by an enzyme called a lipoxygenase, and that lipoxygenase catalyzes the formation of leukotrienes. And we know that leukotrienes are involved in inflammation. The other side, it's also catalyzed or broken down or metabolized by COX-1 and COX-2. COX-1 is constitutively expressed. I'll try to write this in blue. So COX-1 is a constitutively constitutively expressed enzyme. It's always there, it's always present in the body. While this COX-2 is inducible, the COX-1 and COX-2 meta breakdown arachidonic acid into prostaglandin G2, and again the same enzymes will then break down I wrote them in green. So COX-1, COX-2, again COX-1, COX-2, so COX-1, COX-2, these are enzymes in red, will then either catalyze the formation of, how do you this? I wrote the formation of, I'll do this in black, of either no, actually I've made a mistake. So COX-1 and COX-2 again, before we actually even get to that, will actually catalyze the formation of, I think this is this H or prostaglandin H2. I may have made a mistake with G and H, I'm trying to remember. Anyway, and then again this is COX-1, COX-2, and then prostaglandin G will then become either thromboxane A2 or prostacyclin, and this is via enzymes prostacyclin. I can't remember if there's an E. Probably there isn't. Synthase and thromboxane synthase. I didn't info. And thromboxane and prostacyclin are polar opposites. Prostacyclin inhibits platelet activation. Prostacyclin is also a vasodilator, similar to nitric oxide. Thromboxane, on the other hand, activates platelets and is a vasoconstrictor. So there we are. We've now arrived at thromboxane, which activates platelets, and indeed, which is part of the hemostasis. And in terms of hemostasis itself, it occurs via a vasospasm, vasoconstriction, platelet activation, and aggregation, and then 4, clot formation, which really is the cross-linking of fibrin. And then eventually there has to be fibrinolysis, which is the degradation of that clot, degradation of the clot following repair of the previously damaged endothelium. So these are the 5 major pathways of hemostasis, and the proteins which are important in hemostasis, or the factors really that are important in hemostasis, or substances which are important in hemostasis, including the cells, will obviously be like components, will include the platelets themselves, thromboxane, the coagulation factors, shall we say, von Willebrand factor, calcium, fibrinogen, ADP, ATP, serotonin, histamine, growth factors, obviously thrombin is part of the coagulation factors, so I'm not really going to list them down. What have I forgotten? So these are the components that are required, and indeed red blood cells, because they are the ones that become trapped in that mesh when platelets are aggregating and that cross-linking is forming. It does trap red blood cells as well, and when that stasis really happens, it's the stasis of red blood cells to indeed cover that site of injury. So in terms of talking about an injury, really what happens, I know that I briefly covered this during acute coronary syndromes, but now I'm actually going to expand on the previous information. So we'll have an endothelium, or shall we just say vessel, lined by endothelium, and under that endothelium we have collagen fibers, really. So this is our endothelium. These are endothelial cells, and again similar, really. How shall we do collagen in green? So we have our collagen there, subendothelial collagen. And what happens is, when an injury occurs on that endothelium, so normally vessel, there'll be blood flowing, and blood has obviously platelets as well. They are part of that blood flow. They are always in the blood. They're secreted by megakaryocytes, which are made in the bone marrow. And when a megakaryocyte releases platelets, it releases about 1,000 platelets, which are very short-lived. I think their span is quite short-lived anyway. So they are in the blood, and when there is damage to the vessel, this can be due to anything, like for example in acute coronary syndrome, that atherosclerotic plaque rupturing due to, you know, anything really, perhaps increased oxygen demands causing the shearing and the tearing, anything really causing that rupture, or anything that damages the endothelium. So that damage to the endothelium exposes that endothelial collagen. So number one, damage to vessel endothelium exposes endothelial collagen. So we have that exposed collagen there. And importantly, when this collagen is exposed, it causes platelets to home in towards it so as to bind. So that is the first signal for platelet activation. And another thing that happens is that this damaged endothelium also secretes tissue factor. So we have two things that happens when injury occurs. Platelets will bind to the endothelium. So as platelets move towards the endothelium, because if we were to remember, in the normal endothelium, platelets are kept away from the collagen. There is a layer of cells in between endothelium and the platelets, and the function of that layer of cells is to separate platelets and endothelium, just in case of any minor damage which can then activate platelets. Therefore, platelets are kept mobile, blood is always moving, along a smooth endothelium. There is no shearing, there is no tear, there are no stress. Everything happens normally and naturally. There is nitric oxide being secreted, there is sulfate, there is heparin sulfate being secreted as well, as is prostacyclin, and all these components inhibit platelet activation. However, the minute the endothelium is injured, it releases tissue factor. It also exposes collagen, which activates platelets. And then number two, platelets will bind exposed collagen. So this damage anyway causes that activation of platelets, and platelets will then bind that exposed collagen and become even more activated, And when platelets are activated, they release fibrinogen. Well, they will release, shall we just say they will release, they have granules inside them, so they will release alpha granules and dense granules. And these granules contain, the alpha granules, well, I'll just say them together because I've now mixed them up, or I can just do the dense granules here. The dense granules will contain ADP, calcium, which I'm actually going to write in short. Will also contain ATP, serotonin, histamine, and growth factors. The alpha granules will secrete fibrinogen, von Willebrand factor 5, factor 7. Thromboxane, of course, you know, there was also platelets also in thromboxane A2, as we've already seen. Another component really. I've just tried to focus on the main players of, you know, the cascade, so that we can get on really. So I mean, from here we can already see that you know, we're quite ready to activate, you know, the tissue factor pathway, because we already have everything that we need really to activate that tissue factor pathway. Factor 7 as well, you know, is usually found in the blood, so I like to include it here because yeah, because it actually makes it nicer and links everything together. So the activation of platelets and the release of all its components causes it to then bind to that endothelium, which to our green endothelium. So this, it's not even endothelium, it's the collagen. So this is collagen, endothelial collagen. And platelets bind collagen via a number of receptors. They will bind using von Willebrand. I can't really factor. They will also bind directly onto the collagen using the glycoprotein 1A, 2A receptor and the glycoprotein 6 receptors. So these are the receptors that will bind platelets directly, will bind, that platelets will use to bind the collagen directly. Platelets will also use GP 1,5, is it 9 receptor? Oh, I always forget the name of this receptor actually. To bind the collagen via the von Willebrand GP1 something. There's another letter there which I've forgotten. Receptor to bind onto collagen, but this is not a direct binding. This is via von Willebrand. So again, binding of platelets again causes them to become even more activated by releasing, you know, causing them to be even more activated by releasing all of that, which propagates activation and augment that activation. So platelets will activate themselves in an autocrine and paracrine activation. So platelet activation become activated in an autocrine and paracrine fashion through the release of all of its granules and constituents that are inside platelets. So once we have platelets bound onto the endothelium, unfortunately all of this has to go. I just have this, the TF being released. So once we have platelets bound onto that exposed collagen, we will have this scenario. So let's just say this is via, and then we'll have another platelet perhaps bound using GP6. We will then have obviously all of this is happening simultaneously. There isn't differences in, oh, this one is doing this one is doing that. Then we'll have another platelet, perhaps bound via GP1A 2A receptor, and bound platelets will keep on, releasing all those constituents to cause even more activation, even more binding of platelets onto that collagen, onto that exposed collagen. And then we'll have van Willebrand will then catalyze the conformational change of one of the platelet receptors which is called GP2A B. Is it 2B, 3A? Oh gosh, I've now forgotten all these receptors. If I don't think about it, I just do it. Then whenever I think, I end up confusing myself. And they then, in between them, will, remember when platelets are activated, they secrete fibrinogen. So these receptors will fibrinogen will house. So again, this is the same receptor, GP receptor. So they will house fibrinogen, and obviously we call this, when you look at it, we call this aggregation. And these are platelets which are aggregating. There will obviously be other receptors, as well, between platelets, perhaps van Willebrand. Oh gosh, I don't know why, or, again, this being. So all this will cause, platelets to just aggregate between themselves and form that, aggregate, and that platelet aggregation is really primary hemostasis. So then, just to summarize, so the primary hemostasis really is based on, number one, that injury causing platelets to become activated, the secretion of thromboxane causing vasoconstriction, the stoppage of the secretion of all the anti-coagulation factors such as nitric oxide, such as sulfate, heparin sulfate, I don't know why I always say sulfate, but I know it's heparin sulfate, such as prostacyclin, such as anti-tissue factor, such as thrombomotion. They also, thrombomotion will still be there, but its mechanism in anti-clotting is more directed towards protein C. So all of that